The desert is a place of heightened awareness. The Spirit sends Jesus into the wilds after his baptism. The wilderness is a literal place, hot and dry and arid, in stark contrast to the place where Jesus has been baptized by John. He's gone into the water and the heavens have opened and God has declared that he is the beloved Son. But out in the desert, with all the distractions eliminated and less sustenance, Jesus is both more aware of what is spiritual, of both light and darkness in such a place. Jesus knows that the spiritual becomes more real there, where it's not empirically verifiable. And from the desert, Jesus emerges with both clarity of message and purpose to begin his ministry. But of course, it could have been otherwise. Jesus could have gone into the desert and simply spent his time being hungry and kind of lost and killing time, emerging pretty much unchanged. This counterfactual is not something we really entertain because we often assume that these stories of Jesus are as they are. The outcome is somehow predetermined. But then that doesn't really take serious Jesus's humanity, and it certainly doesn't let us find much of a place in the story. The desert is actually a place of testing for Jesus. It harks back to the time when the nascent people of Israel came out of Egypt and spent some time wandering in the desert before they went to the promised land. And the desert then, and for Jesus, is a place where both light and dark is, where one is open to what God is doing, but equally one could miss the opportunity that entering the desert comes with some risk to it. The risks seem to be several. It's important to note that Jesus enters this time of heightened sort of spiritual discipline after his baptism. In each gospel that records a baptism and a wilderness, they always come in that order. That it's essential Jesus know who he is before he enters this difficult time in the desert. He has to know without a doubt that he is the beloved, the Son of God. That's what's proclaimed to him at the baptism. And we don't know if he knew that before with definite clarity, had an inclination, or was sort of surprised by this news the dove descending brought in the Jordan. But it's only until he's heard that truth that he can go into the desert. He has to know who he is. Because if he's unsure, he'll spend the entire time in the desert just doubting God, doubting himself, and he won't get what he needs from that time in the desert. But there's also the risk of just sort of distraction. Jesus goes out there because there's less distraction, but there's nothing to keep him from sort of being overly hungry and giving in, or just missing companionship and giving in. Jesus, what's amazing is he maintains focus the entire time he's out there. He doesn't let the hunger distract him. He doesn't get so caught up in missing being in the city that he leaves early. There's nothing out there but the silence and himself to become aware of the spiritual realm. And once Jesus is able to sort of be in that space, he begins to have a heightened awareness of both the demonic presence that's out there and the angels that are attending him, the own shadows and evil and the goodness and grace. Jesus must confront both of those in the wilderness. And he has to do so with focus, maintaining why he's out there and not giving in to kind of a laziness, a succumbing to heat or hunger that takes him away from his purpose. And it's only when he's spent time engaging with the possibility of temptation and listening to the grace present that he can emerge from the desert ready to do what he needs to do. Baptism always comes before desert, and desert always comes before ministry in the Gospels. They follow that order always. And the order we follow, of course, is that this is the beginning of Lent. And this passage about Jesus and the temptation is one we read every first Sunday in Lent. It's an invitation to the desert. This season of Lent comes on the heels of the season of Epiphany. You'll remember that the first Sunday after the wise men show up is always the baptism of Jesus. That's where we begin the new year, with Jesus' baptism. And then we spend the season of Epiphany exploring what that meant for who Jesus was. But Epiphany is also an invitation to consider our own baptism and explore what that means for us, what it means to be God's beloved child, to ground ourselves in that identity and be confident in it. Having done that, then, we enter the season of Lent. Just in Jesus's life, so it is in ours. The invitation to baptism, to knowing who we are, is followed by an invitation to deepen that knowledge, to go into the desert for a time. Lent has the tradition that we give up something, not just arbitrarily, but something that fills our thoughts or our minds, something that distracts us from God. We give it up in Lent to be focused. And maybe we pick up a new spiritual discipline, something that opens our heart to God in a new way. It's essential that we enter this season of Lent, this own desert invitation, from a stance of knowing we are the beloved, baptized and claimed by God. And then we're able to enter better, aware of what the risks are, that the risks in the desert are the same as they were for Jesus. That perhaps we'll lose our focus, that perhaps we won't remember we're the beloved, and we'll spend some time doubting ourselves and doubting who God is. That the spiritual disciplines we've chosen or the thing we've given up, we miss it too much, or just fall into kind of a boredom about it, and our senses become dulled to where God is. But if we commit to maintaining our focus, then we realize that our heart is more open to discover where God is moving within us and around us and among us. That in this season, it's a time to engage our shadow self, to put down burdens perhaps we don't need to be carrying, to work on our unhealthy relational habits, whether that's anger or manipulation or denial. Or maybe this is a time to focus on being still, to be quieter, and see where God is present to us in that stillness. Distractions abound, darkness and boredom, and the threat of evil ranges. They're all present in the desert, and that's the risk of entering. But with risk comes the promise of God. That if we see in this Lenten season, if we hear this Lenten message as an invitation to something deeper, that is the Spirit of God moving in us. That we go into this time as the beloved of God in the power and presence of the Spirit. With a Lent well spent in a desert unique to each of us, the promise of new clarity, of renewed purpose, of reignited hope, of simply seeing God in new ways awaits us as we leave and then will reemerge into Easter. But however our desert is, and however we reemerge, the Epiphany truth remains. We are the beloved. The desert is an invitation to just know that truth more deeply, for it to move from our head to our heart, and perhaps more deeply into our hearts. May we listen this Lent for how the Spirit is speaking to each of us, inviting us to our own deserts that will challenge us, strengthen us, and send us forth with new clarity and renewal of purpose and hope.